Hello friends, this is Marilyn from tarotclarity.com, and I have not been around for about a week and a half. I've been working on creating my Patreon account, in order to make it as good as I can for my subscribers. So I hope you understand and don't mind, and I will try to make it up to you with this video, my long absence. This is probably my rarest and probably probably my most special, not necessarily my most favorite, but one of my most favorite and my most special because it's rare decks. It's the Carte fine al Mondo, Tarocco Bolognese, restored by Marco Benedetti. He obtained rights to these images and to print them for profit, to sell them in 2020, I think. What's the date? It's July of 2020. And he only sold 20 copies. And I was so fortunate to find out about it and purchase it, and lucky enough to have copy number 4. Now, what makes this deck so special is that aside from decks of this that are extant in libraries or museums, I believe these are the only 20 copies that are just floating around, that are not, museum decks. Now, some people may have gotten, electronic images and printed them for themselves personally, like at playing cards or something like that. And I'm not saying that it's possible to do that, but I think if you could get your hands on them for nonprofit, you could do that. But these are actually, this is actually a deck that was created for the purpose of, selling it, and, high quality cardstock, etc., or special quality cardstock. Now, what made this deck so special? It's very similar to the Fine della Torre, which I've shown a few times, and I may have compared that deck with this deck, but it's not exactly the same. And the reason for that being, in 1725, the church made a requirement of decks out of Bologna, Italy, to replace the cards number 2 through 5, which were the female pope, the empress, the emperor, and the pope, with cards representing the 4 Moors, which were rulers from different places in the world, to kind of, eliminate the power struggle between, the church and the secular rulers of Europe, or Italy in particular, and any reference to religious and secular power struggles that might, have offended the church, because, So, at any rate, so these guys were put in. Now, I don't know if I have them in the correct order. I know when they occurred in play that they were given equal rank and value, so that there was no argument. They were all equal. And if 2 players both laid down, one of these cards, the one who laid the card more recently was the one who won the bid. So we have the difference between them is that one holds a staff with a moon, which is a nod, I believe, to the secularity, to the, the female. And here's just one with arrows, bows and arrows. Here's one, again, with bows and arrows, just slightly different. And then one with the sun, with a scepter with a sun. So let's look at these cards. Oh, why did I do that? Okay. So we have the Fool, which has, some precedence as a noisemaker. Feathers in his hair, playing music. And again, throughout this deck, like we did see in the Fina della Torre and other decks from Bologna, like the Ancient Tarot of Bologna, who made that? Zoni. And I believe the Trieste too, where we have a lot of unusual red dots that occur throughout the decks. And it's like consistent in Bologna, decks from Bologna. Here we have the modern day equivalent of, or what we now call in modern times, the Magician. Four Moors. Now, another reason that this deck is very unusual is because at some point, the Bolognese created a double-headed deck. And so almost immediately after the Four Moors came out, the Bolognese deck became a double-headed deck, you see. So it's rare to have a deck with the Four Moors that is not double-headed. And these dots, and sometimes they seem random and sometimes they seem very deliberate. It's going up, the sword. It outlines her hair. It's at the tips of some of the sun rays. And then it seems random on the scale. It appears, in the bodice of her garment. And then random again on the ground. So, and it seems pretty random on his head of the hermit. So it fascinates me every time I pull out one of these decks to see all these dots. Some people think it's really intentional. Some think it could be random, like something that occurs because of glue or mold or something like that. But I don't know. I've seen a lot of requests on online forums, tarot forums, about where someone could get this deck. And like I said, I think, I don't, and unless you purchase the right to, find somebody to purchase the rights to the images and then prints them out for sale, I think maybe you're a little out of luck unless you're able to get the images from whatever museum they're in and print them for your own personal use. I just happen to be extremely fortunate in having scored this deck for myself. So here we have a little bit of a Krampus thing, we have the devil with the long tongue. The unusual feet. The date on this is 1725, and we know it's 1725 because that's when the Four Moors replaced the female pope, the two secular rulers, and then the pope. And then sometime after that, I don't think it was very much longer, after 1725, as I mentioned, the Bolognese became double-headed. So this was a rare moment in time where we had the four Moors in the traditional format. And it's a nice deck to use, although, it's far from, I guess being inclusive, because there's only 4 people of color in this deck. It is more inclusive than any of the other decks of its time. And I don't necessarily, feel like that has to be apologized for. I mean, it was a tradition, an Italian invention. And, for the most part, the Italians were Caucasian people. And, like any other culture, if you are, if Asians were to create something and it was represented by and large with Asian personalities, who would be offended by that? It's just, the history of the product, or African, or any other race. It just so happened that the Italians, for the most part, were Caucasian, and that's how they made their deck. But it is nice to see the 4 Moors in the deck, especially since they are individuals in positions of power. And there's not much you can do about changing history. Moving forward, you can create tarot decks that had that have more variety of humans. Another good thing about the Italians, though, is that for the suits of cups and coins, the page or the valet position was usually a female. So you had 2 female courts and 2 male courts. So they at least did that in that period of time. So I thought maybe it might be nice to do a brief reading, because I know you guys like to see readings. So the payoff for having endured my little talk is to use these in a reading, and it'll give us a chance to see the cards in action. These are smaller than typical, and Bolognese decks in general seem to be quite long, narrow and long. Let me see if I can. Here's a standard playing card from oh no, this is a Bolognese. Let me pause and get a standard tarot deck and show how they compare in size. Okay, so I reached in my workhorse box and I grabbed another Italian deck. This one, published by Lo Scarabeo, the Ancient Italian Tarot, which is a standard tarot size. And you see that it's a petite deck. I don't know if this is the actual size or if Marco Benedetti chose to do it on a petite scale. It's slightly smaller than a standard deck as far as height, and considerably more narrow. Okay, so let me pause to shuffle and mix the cards. Although this is quality paper, it's also kind of, I don't think it's made for riffle shuffle, and I want to be very delicate with it. So I'm going to take my time with shuffling, and I'll be back in a few minutes. I want to mention that in the time that I was mixing the cards, I also refreshed my mind on the information provided on the additional card, that this was an abbreviated deck of 62 cards, and because this deck has 78 cards, it stands to reason that Marco did add the additional cards, recreated the additional cards in order to make them able to be used as a regular tarot deck, although you could certainly use it without the full restoration of the deck, but I just prefer to use a full restoration, which is probably why I bought this deck. And then the other point being that I think it wasn't immediate after 1725 that they did this, making them double-headed. It seems like by 1760, that's when the Bolognese decks not only were included the 4 Moors, but became double-headed. So I wanted to add that in addition to what I've already said. Okay, so I never came up with a question. Okay, let's see. Well, those of you who read tarot, you know that most of the questions are interpersonal. They're usually about either neighbors, or they're about love or family. But this is a day or two before Valentine's Day, and most of us probably got our fair share of romantic questions, so why don't we do that? And this is a lovely deck to use for romance. So, the question is, will an individual, will Mary, hear from Joe on Valentine's? Now, intellectually, in our heads, when we get a question like that, will she hear from Joe on Valentine's? Chances are good that she's not Joe's Valentine, because if she were, she wouldn't be wondering if she'd hear from him on Valentine's. But sometimes there are people in our lives who we have an interest in, we flirt with, without really having gone on a date or anything like that. And so sometimes, Valentine's Day is a hopeful day for some people, where they hope that maybe the person that they have an interest in might just use the opportunity of the Valentine's Day as an opportunity to just reach out and show someone they're interested. Now, there are a number of ways where you could do yes/no readings. Some do, if it's like a even or odd number, that'll tell you, they have a system like that. Mostly, I just look at the cards and I interpret the cards basically just to get a sense of, the energies, if they're positive and negative. So we'll take a look. We have, okay, for those of you who might use even odd, we have a 2 of Swords, which is an even number. We have the King of Baton. And we have the Knight of Coin. Now, we can say that the only numbered card in this lot is the 2, which is a number of companionship or some type of duality. But it's not a cup card, right? It's, if it was a 2 of Cups, I'd be much more enthusiastic. But it's more like a duality, or maybe it's more of a, it could even be like a low-level conflict. And it's followed by individuals who are looking at one another. Now, it's possible that Joe is preoccupied at some level with someone else who's taking, who's his focus is on. It's not to say that this is necessarily a romantic thing that Joe has, but it could be father-son. It could just be, a mentor relationship with someone. But it seems as though Joe's attentions are elsewhere. And although we have a 2 here, it's, to me, reading more like a conflicted 2 and not one of, interest in Mary. So let's try another reading. Let me handle and mix the cards off camera, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I thought of a question. Sometimes mothers are very concerned about their children and the direction they're taking. And we have Stephanie, who has a 16-year-old son who is really headed toward what appears to be becoming a high school dropout. And she's done everything she understands how to do to get him, to comply with typical rules for going to school every day. It seems like maybe he lost momentum with COVID and being homeschooled or, remote learning, and he wasn't really a good candidate. Maybe he wasn't disciplined enough, or he just didn't have the support at home that he needed, or for whatever reason, maybe his mother had to go to work and had to leave him home and trust him to do it on his own. But whatever reason, now that school's back in session, he's just not going back to school, and she's concerned that he's going to be a dropout. So another maybe yes or no reading. Will he get himself together? And will he manage to get back on track for the remainder of this school year? So we're looking for yes or no. So we have, the card that I usually will interpret as a trickster card, right? We have a young man going in another direction, but looking back. And then we have another young man, a younger man yet. Okay, so let's see what we have here. Now, I said that this could be a trickster card, but in the context of the question, it could be, maybe stretched to maybe be someone who has like young attendants, right? Maybe a teaching scenario. I mean, that's not what this card means, and I think it's a little bit of a stretch. But if you read in the context of the question, and if it strikes you that this could be like a teacher with a desk and pupils, I mean, it could be. And in fact, it may be the way Stephanie feels when she sees this card. Because remember, the interpretation is not for us personally. It's for what the client who comes to us is looking for, right? So the way we might interpret this card, the way I would interpret this card typically, might not be the way, Stephanie receives this image, And in the context of a question about a student who's not doing so good in a classroom setting, this might strike her as like a classroom scenario, right? Now, coupled with the information that you provide with her, like saying that, well, maybe there's like a trickster kind of element to this, or it might be that, him being in the classroom is kind of tricky. And then we have a young man who is a mature adult, a young adult, maybe not like a mature adult, but like a young adult. And he's reflective, perhaps. He's looking back at this, or maybe he's moving forward into young adulthood, kind of aware that he's, maybe not doing the right thing. And then it proceeds with an individual who's, less mature and less responsible than even this individual. So it seems like he probably will break away. And it seems like maybe he will, is very close to, or very on the verge of going in the direction of leaving school. Now you'll notice that none of these cards, well, only this card has a numeric value of 1. So it's a singularity, Now you don't want to give a terrible answer and say, oh, he's doomed, he's dropping out of school. But you just want to validate that it's a very real concern, and that's a very real possibility, and that not to be surprised if that's what happens, and try to appeal to him while he's still in this stage before he goes and separates himself and becomes less adult than what he's processing in his own mind right now, because it does look like he's processing it. He is thinking of going away, but he is still thinking about his experience in school. So there is still a thread of hope, I feel, in this reading, but that if, you know, but he is, yes, on the verge of dropping out. And let's do one more, yes or no. So I don't think, I don't like to do just yes or no questions. I like to do questions that are more critical thinking. But a lot of times, and I don't want to say this, but it's true to some degree, sometimes clients kind of separate themselves from the work, that is required to invest, to create a more likely scenario. And sometimes they just want cut to the chase, yes or no, is this going to happen? And as much as I really prefer to sit down with like my 13 card spread and to help map them out like a course of action that would help them most likely to, give them ideas to help them get back on track. Sometimes they don't want all that. Sometimes they just want confirmation. Sometimes they just want, a quick answer. And so that's why I think it's important to have a way to come up with yes or no responses. And, I don't like to do it based on, even odd numbers, because as you saw, I think in both of these, we only had of the 6 cards laid for both of those readings, we only had 2 cards that had numbers on them, like the Magician and the 2 of Swords. So you can't really rely on that, method of even odd. Okay, so let's have another question. Let's say this individual, another interpersonal. Okay. Say because it is Valentine, say a couple is dating and they're kind of youngish, in the relation, not that they're young people, but the relationship is kind of youngish, newish. And say that the client is a man and he wants to know if it would be appropriate at this stage to maybe bring a little trinket for his current partner's youngster. Say his partner has a little one, and he's thinking about bringing something, a little gift. But he doesn't want to rub his partner the wrong way. He doesn't want it to look like he's coming on too strong or whatever. So he's just looking to see if that might not be a bad idea. Okay. So we have the 3 of Cups. So we have a partnership with, a couple, right? Involved in an emotional thing with a third person. So it could be the youngster. So there's validation of that. Again, we read the cards in the context of the question, or at least that's how I interpret the cards. Then there might be some conflict because we have the 2 of Swords. And although 2 is a number of partnership, with the Swords, it's kind of like, more like a conflict maybe, or a competition or something like that. So there's a suggestion that could create a little bit of tension. And then we have the 5 of Cups. For me, I interpret the 5 numbers, as a little bit of an instability, right? And so because it is the suit of cups and emotion, it could like upset the balance of things. Now, if we want to come up with the quintessential, just to hope that it might confirm, that this might not be it's not going to be a catastrophic thing unless the Quint card suggests it would be. But it just seems like maybe at this stage it's a little too early to maybe do that, But let's take a look at what the Quint would be. So we have a 3 and a 2, which is a 5, and a 5, which is a 10. So we all know that would be the Wheel of Fortune. Let me pull the Wheel of Fortune. Give me a sec. So here we have the Wheel of Fortune. Now, again, remember that the client is looking at the cards just as well as we are. And, he might see that by doing this, he might think of it as calamity, because here he is he's on top of his game, right? He's like doing good with this person. And then, if he introduces, a gift to the youngster, it just might topple him. So although the Wheel of Fortune could suggest going with the flow or feeling such a situation out, depending on the context of the question, it really, in many historic aspects has to do with being on top 1 minute and not being on top the next. And so there's a chance that this card confirms the suggestion of these other cards, that by doing that, it might topple his standing with his partner, so that it might not be catastrophic, but it might not really be a great idea. It might diminish the way the partner views him. It could be that the partner feels like it's a little too much too soon, or it's just an uncomfortable thing. So there we have it. So I hope you've enjoyed seeing these beautiful cards. Here's the back, which are the actual backs. It's got a crown and a checkered floor with columns. Maybe it's a reflection in a mirror. I'm not really sure. And before I sign off, I'll just have us look at a few. We have Temperance, 4 coins, the Star, Sun, World. I love worlds that don't have a person in the center of a mandala. Again, all those dots. So we see the 2 maidens that would traditionally be male, but the Bolognese and some of the other Italian decks, I believe, also. For the feminine suits, which would be the cups and the coins, they made them often female. In some of the older decks, you do see the hunt, represented by the hound and the hare, as we do in this Ace of Coin. Just a lovely, lovely deck. And I believe actually there's only one extant deck that exists, and I believe it's in the a British museum. So there aren't multiple extant decks that exist. There's only one known original that exists, and I believe this little information sheet said that it was in the British Museum, has the only known copy. So this is indeed an extremely rare deck, and I am so very fortunate to own a copy. And as I said, a lot of people seem to be interested in it. Look how pretty those are. And it's nice to see, diverse faces represented in a deck, in this modern age when, we live among many different people. We're not living in ancient Italy, or not even that ancient, but we're not living in, Renaissance Italy. Oh, these fellas didn't get shuffled away. They stayed together when I shuffled. So it's nice to see diversity in an older tarot deck, because we don't see that in the older decks. And, I think it's really an unfortunate thing. I'm not apologizing for it, because they're historic decks, and so that's the way it was, that there weren't a whole lot of people of color. But it's nice to have a historic deck that has at least some representation. Well, friends, until next time, and bear in mind, remember, I am doing a lot of work behind the scenes for my Patreon account, which I hope to be launching in March, I hope. Until next time, friends, and peace, and stay well.